Welcome to this walk through Philippians 2 verses 22 to 24. We're in a section of the letter in which Paul tells the Philippians of his plans to send Timothy and Epaphroditus to them. We began the section last time with verses 19 to 21, and there we heard Paul commend Timothy as one who has a genuine concern for the things of Christ and not just his own self-interest. Now we hear the rest of this description of Timothy and some further details of Paul's plans. So verse 22 is our first sentence. Tein de dokimein autou genoskete, hoti hos patri teknon sun emoi edulusin eis ta euangelion. So just take that first clause to begin with, tein de dokimein autou genoskete. So he's speaking of Timothy, and Paul tells the Philippians, you know his dokime. Now the verb dokimadzo has two main senses. It can refer to the process of testing, for example, of metals. So you can translate to test or evaluate or appraise. But it can also be used for the results of such testing. And so you could translate it approve, certify, think fit. And this noun has the same two senses. It can refer to testing or it can refer to the results of the testing. And here it seems to be the results, the outcome of the test, not the testing itself. And so we could translate this, as some translations do, proven character. So Paul tells the Philippians, you all know his proven character. Notice how this direct object is fronted. It's there at the beginning of the clause. And so it catches our attention, and there's a little bit of emphasis on it then. And this de is probably adversative, because the previous verse Paul had been talking about these other folks who were seeking their own interest. And so now here Paul contrasts them with Timothy, but the proven worth of this guy, you know. Genoskete is in the present tense, and the present tense has a progressive aspect. In other words, it's a way of viewing an action or a state as something that's ongoing or progressing in some sense. So I thought we'd take a minute and step back and think about the analysis of the verb form. We can think of the sense of verbs as being either telic or atelic. Telic sense, the meaning of the verb includes a sense of conclusion. So for example, they closed the door. The verb close implies the conclusion of that activity. There's a natural stopping point for this action of to close. But atelic, one is a verb that doesn't include this sense of conclusion. And to know is an atelic verb because there's no built-in conclusion. There's no natural stopping point. The condition of knowing can go on indefinitely. Now, contrast that with the English verbs to notice or conclude or recognize. Each of those, there's a conclusion. There's a stopping point built in. Recognize, then you have recognized. And these are all ways in which gnosko can be translated in some context. And in those contexts, gnosko usually is in the aorist. But when it means to know, it's often in the present. So the present is often used with verbs that have an atelic sense, no built-in conclusion. So here the present tense is a natural choice for this context. I recommend this article by Stephen Baugh, The Introduction to Greek Tense Form Choice in Non-Indicative Moods. Rob Plummer has it on the Daily Dose of Greek website. I've listed for you there the URL, although you could just do a search for Baugh tense form choice or something like that and find it easily. It's a very helpful free article, PDF, and it's also available in print form as a self-published thing that you can find. If you want more detail, then check out Buist Fanning's book, Verbal Aspect in New Testament Greek. He talks about bounded and unbounded verbs, but goes into a lot more detail. There's a lot of debate about all these kinds of issues at present, and if you want a quick overview of that debate and some of the key players, then check out the Appendix 5 and Using and Enjoying Biblical Greek. So, continuing on with our second clause in this first sentence, hoti hos patri teknon sun emoi edulusen eis ta euangelion. Hoti here could either signal this clause is in apposition to the dokimain. So in a map, we could put it lined up flush under tain dokimain, or we could put it underneath the verb genoskete, and it could function as a causal clause going with genoskete. And we'll come back to these two options once we sort out the details of the clause. The verb here in this clause, edulusin, he served as a slave, is modified by a comparative clause beginning with hos and two prepositional phrases, soon and ace. So let's take the prepositional phrases first. Paul says Timothy served as a slave soon emoi. Now emoi, this form, is sometimes a bit more emphatic than a simple moi, but there's probably no emphasis here. This expression, soon emoi, is used 13 times in the Greek Bible, in other words, the Septuagint and the New Testament. But if you look up soon moi, it's never used. So it's just, this is the way they said this. Maybe it just sounded better to have that vowel in between the nu and the mu sound. But in any case, there's no emphasis here. It's not me as opposed to somebody else. Now looking at the other prepositional phrase, eis ta euangelion, CGEL, in other words, Danker's Concise Lexicon, describes this use of eis as with a focus on intention, and gives the gloss for or with a view to. Abbott Smith uses larger, more general categories, and he has this one as simply of relation, and gives the glosses to, towards, for, in regard to. So in other words, Timothy served as a slave for the gospel, or in regard to the gospel. It was in relation to the gospel that Timothy was serving as a slave with Paul. Moving now to the comparative clause, hos, we see that a verb, doulue, has been elided. So we'd have, you know that, or you know this is proven worth because he served with me for the sake of the gospel as a child serves as a slave, patri. Now this dative patri could be understood as the direct object of doulue. And you'd have something like, as a child serves the father or their father as a slave. You know, as a child serves a father as a slave. And that's how the English Revised Version takes it. Or it could be a dative of association, as a child serves as a slave with a father, or with their father. And all the other English translations I checked, about 11 of them, all take it as a dative of association. That makes a lot of sense because the other part of the comparison explicitly has the soon here. And so pointing to a dative of association down here in the patri. So now we can go back to the function of this haughty. If it's in apposition to tain dokimain, then it's saying Timothy's serving with Paul as a slave is a description of his proven character. And the ESV takes it that way. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how, as a son with a father, he has served with me in the gospel. And if it's causal, then it gives the cause of the Philippians knowing Timothy's proven worth. And so that's how the Christian Standard Bible and the NIV take it, as you see. But you know his proven character because he has served with me in the gospel ministry, like a son with a father. And the NIV similar. And they would know that because Timothy was with Paul there in Philippi, it appears, from Acts. And this would corroborate that. So either one of these works. It's hard to tell which we should go with here. And notice that Timothy's proven character is seen as his serving as a slave, and therefore sharing in the mindset of Christ that we saw back in the Christ hymn in chapter 2, verse 7. And Timothy did so with Paul, here soon emoi, meaning Paul also serves as a slave. And so both Paul and Timothy here are pictured as modeling the mindset of Christ that we saw in the hymn. And one of Paul's favorite designations of himself is doulos, slave. And this letter in particular began that way in the first verse, Paulos kai Timotheos douloi Christou Jesu. Now we move on to our second sentence in our passage for today. Touton men un elpidzo pempsai. Next clause begins with two postpositives, men and un. Abbott Smith summarizes the two main uses of un nicely as consequence or simple sequence. So sequence or consequence. Consequence we translate therefore. A simple sequence we could translate then or so. And the English translations are divided over which sense we have here. I think the simple sequence seems better. So I'm hoping to send this one. Now men is often matched by de, and we have that in our next part of the sentence. And CJL notes that men is very often used in a statement that invites a contrasting, alternate, or modifying observation with de or other markers, thus uniting statements often in opposition to one another. I think there's times when there's not much opposition. I think Abbott Smith has a better explanation of this word. He says it's usually related to a following de or other adversative conjunction, and distinguishing the word or clause with which it stands from that which follows. I think of men as simply a way of packaging one unit that will be in some kind of relation with one or more other units. And so here the idea of it distinguishing bits instead of always having this sense of opposition, even though it's using an adversative conjunction. The opposition is not often there, or at least many times it's not. So here we have a men de may package the two parts of Paul's intended contact with the Philippians. He's sending Timothy, and then he himself plans the visit, as we hear pretty soon. So there's no opposition between those, but they are distinguished. They're two parts to his topic here. So as you meet men de constructions, or sometimes the de is not there, it's just men, watch to see if there's opposition or if it's simply a packaging, distinguishing of different units within the thought. So pempsai here, an aorist infinitive functioning as a complementary infinitive with elpidzo, filling in the content of what Paul's hoping. I'm hoping to send this guy, Touton, and again fronted for a bit of emphasis. The New Jerusalem Bible catches that nuance. They have, this is the man then that I'm hoping to send to you. Now our next bit, hos on aphido ta peri eme. The hos on is often seen to be the equivalent of hotan. I'm not sure that's quite accurate, because hotan can be used of an uncertain event or of a certain event whose time is uncertain. But with this expression, hos on, it doesn't have those two uses, judging by the examples that are cited in BDAG anyway. Instead, it points to a certain event that will happen at an uncertain time. So Paul sending Timothy is not an uncertain event, it's just he's not sure when it's going to happen. And so BDAG suggests the gloss, the translation here for hos on as soon as. So as soon as aphido. So aphido is a first singular active aorist subjunctive from horao, and you can see the etymology of it, to look from. And some scholars take it to have this idea of look away from the present to the future. You see Abbott Smith thinks of it as to look away from all else, and that gets at the actual meaning of it, which is to fix one's gaze upon, or to see in that more intense sense. I checked out Montanari, the large, fairly recent lexicon for all of ancient Greek literature, and you see the senses that are given there. They include in the active to watch from a distance, to observe, to keep under one's gaze, watch, stare, contemplate, or in the middle to watch or contemplate. This is the verb that's used, for example, in Hebrews 2:12 to fix the gaze upon Jesus. And so if we take that, then our verse here would be something like, as soon as I can fix my gaze on my circumstances. But the context suggests not the process of observing, but the results of such observation. And so many English translations use the more general word to see. So something like, as soon as I see. The New Jerusalem Bible tries to catch that nuance with, immediately I can make out what is going to happen to me. So that catches a little bit more of those senses we saw from the lexicons. And O'Brien, in his commentary on page 326, suggests, as soon as I have a clearer view of my affairs. And so ta peri eme, we've seen similar expressions, but using the genitive back in verses 19 and 20. So as soon as I see the things concerning me, my situation, what's going on with me, my circumstances, a lot of different ways to try and get that into English. And then ex autes, at the end of this clause, is an adverb modifying the infinitive to send. It means at once or immediately or without delay. So once Paul sorts out this stuff about himself, then immediately, at once, he will send Timothy. And scholars speculate what Paul's referring to here, whether he's referring to his release from prison or some other concerns that he has there in the local situation he's in. Then we have a raised dot, so that's separating our clauses. So we have our final two clauses of our sentence. First one, pepoitha de in curio. Pepoitha comes from patho, and here again I'll cite Segel. Danker's Concise Lexicon says in the perfect and pluperfect the word expresses, quote, in effect the product of persuasion. Because patho means to persuade, so now in the perfect and pluperfect, the product of persuasion which one receives. Hence, one can be said to get persuasion, in other words, to have confidence. So in the perfect and pluperfect, this doesn't mean persuasion, but rather to have confidence. Back in chapter 1, Paul said to remain in the flesh is more necessary for your sake, since I'm persuaded of this. Touta pepoithos. So the same verb. I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith. So perhaps that earlier statement is what Paul has in mind when he says that he is confident in curio. In other words, he expects to remain in order to be of help to the Philippians. It's because he's convinced that he is able to help them. And so that kind of concern matches the Lord's own servant mindset. And so Paul has become sure of this, that this is the Lord's will for him. His confidence that he will come to them is not based on his circumstances, but this spiritual conviction that he believes is from the Lord. So I'm confident in the Lord. Hoti kai autos tacheos elusamai. The final clause gives the content of what he's confident about. Elusamai, the future of erchomai, I will come. So I'm confident in the Lord that I will come. The kai here in this context is probably adjunctive, in other words, translated also. And the autos, as is common in the nominative, when there's no article with it, is intensive. I myself. So putting that together, I'm confident in the Lord that I myself also will come soon. And we saw tacheos back in verse 19, where Paul said, now I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon. So here we are at the end of that paragraph that began in verse 19, repeating how it began, but now adding the point that Paul himself expects to be coming to them. In other words, picking up the point he introduced back in chapter 1. Now, in our next section, we will go on in this larger section to turn to Paul's sending of Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus, we'll see, is also one who exemplifies the mind of Christ, seen in the Christ hymn.